Hello, my name is Conny Cassity. I am a graduate student at the University of Colorado Boulder. And my talk today is called Building White Lobbies, Quotation and Dissimulation in the Woman of Color. So before I get started, I want to do a little bit of framing of my talk. So in this paper, I'm going to be talking about Black voices, Black speech of white words in particular. And I recognize that as a white woman, I can't speak for Black women and their experiences with quotation and whiteness. So to talk about these acts, I'm turning to the theories, knowledge, and processes of women of color theorists and authors in order to ground my reading of this 1808 novel, The Woman of Color. Additionally, I'm hoping that my talk can serve as a model for other white academics like myself to sort of give an example of the work that we need to be doing in Romanticism and in the academy at large. And that's really to amplify the ideas and the voices of women of color, but also to carry the burden of educating other people, particularly other white people, about race, racism, the history surrounding these things, and the way that these interact with art. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge that as I'm recording this, I am sitting on the lands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne nations. And I encourage you, wherever you are, to take a moment to acknowledge the people on whose land you're listening. So let's get started. So the anonymously penned novel, The Woman of Color, consistently argues for abolition and for the better treatment of Black people by white Britons. But just as the mixed-race heroine Olivia Fairfield survives in England by performing aspects of whiteness, so does the novel self-consciously narratively dissimulate its racial otherness into Gothic and sentimental conventions common to white readers. In doing so, it entices and disarms these readers with familiarity, even as it educates them in constructing a more racially aware political consciousness. In part, this dissimulation appears in Olivia's quotations of white male voices that are frequently cited in white women's popular fiction. So these appear in myriad forms, in dialogue, in narration, as block quotes, as two-word excerpts. At times they're taken in context, at other times they're twisted into new significance. So for example, she quotes William Wordsworth's descriptive sketches when she describes, quote, benevolence's far-surveying, compassionate eye, and associates it with, quote, promising benign assistance to enslaved Black people in Jamaica. So in the larger version of this project, I'll explicate some of the specific passages that Olivia is using, but for today, I want to speak in broad strokes about how her quotations structure part of the novel's racial dynamics. So I argue that to that end, they're politicized as doubled instances of dissimulation and assimilation. So before I launch into my ideas here, I want to quickly note how the novel positions Olivia's race. This is probably a topic worth its own paper, but for our purposes, I'll give a Cliff Notes version here. So Olivia is the biracial daughter of a Black enslaved woman who dies in childbirth and a white planter whose death incites the novel's events and through the conditions of his will, sets Olivia on this quest to England to gain her inheritance by marrying her cousin. The novel racializes Olivia based on both her olive, and that's the word the novel uses, skin, compared to her Black servant Dido, and her refined manners and her appearance. So Olivia regularly aligns herself with aspects of both her Blackness and her whiteness. And typically the former comes in moments defending abolition, but in her attempts to signal that she can belong in England, she draws on her whiteness, which is what I will discuss here in part through her use of quotation. So dissimulation is key to my work here. Olivia fixates on this action, often framing it as another kind of enslavement. This matches with rhetoric from prominent white feminists like Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Robinson, but in Olivia's case, the term is racially charged as well. For instance, she associates dissimulation with racial prejudice when she roundaboutly censures her future sister-in-law while correcting her future nephew's racist speech. That's that first passage here. In this scene, Olivia praises little George's artless behavior, even if it's harmful, because in her view, his, quote, infantine simplicity makes him amenable to instruction. She warns that, quote, as we grow older, we grow acquainted with dissimulation. And this is a barb that the other characters in this scene recognize, and they condone it as pointing to George's mother's half-hearted attempts to hide her racism. Olivia also uses the term in relation to herself, and that's the second passage here, when she says she, quote, longs to be free from the restraints and the dissimulation which the common rules of good breeding impose in my behavior towards these white city socialites. This last passage in particular suggests that Olivia is accustomed to performing civility for white audiences. And it's what prompts me to consider her general narration to white people as a form of dissimulation as well. So Olivia recognizes that she must appeal to white people to enact change for enslaved Black folks. And in the essay Unspeakable Things Unspoken, Toni Morrison illustrates facing a similar dilemma when she wrote her 1973 novel Sula. So she speaks about capitulating to a white audience, positioning Sula's Black community in relation to its white surroundings, instead of foregrounding Blackness and Black experiences. So this creates, in her words, a safe, welcoming lobby, a threshold between the white reader and the Black topic text. So though this later became embarrassing, and that's her word, to her, she acknowledges it as one of the, quote, strategies one can be forced to resort to in trying to accommodate the mere fact of writing about, for, and out of Black culture, while accommodating and responding to mainstream white, and that's in scare quotes, culture. In my view, Olivia's quotation of white male British literature becomes a kind of white lobby. And in fact, these lines are what Sarah Ahmed calls citational bricks. So they build a text's ideological framework, or if we overlap Ahmed's and Morrison's metaphors, they can build the lobby. Ahmed's philosophy of citation, of course, is almost the perfect inverse of Olivia's. She demands that we be vandals, and that's her word, and refer to other texts than the same old white sources over and over again. But Olivia, on the other hand, deliberately excavates the same quarry as her white female contemporaries. So this now leads us to the novel's racial politics on a stylistic level. On the one hand, Olivia's quotations can humanize her to her white contemporaries. She demonstrates that she too can appreciate British art. She too can have sensibility. She too can derive a Christian framework from what she reads. So as obvious as we now find the truth of Olivia's complex humanity, this appeal actually mirrors Olivia's approach to educating her nephew about racism when she shows him that her skin color is pigment and not dirt. So demonstrating commonalities is really the name of the abolitionist game here. And yet Olivia's Blackness, her difference, is so central to the novel that the title announces it. So Toni Morrison's definition of what makes a text Black is thus relevant here. In her view, a text signals its Blackness through its unpoliced, seditious, confrontational, manipulative, inventive, disruptive, masked and unmasked language. Olivia's language with this definition is both Black and not Black. Its dissimulation approaches the masking and unmasking that Morrison invokes, and yet to call the novel's language unpoliced is a bit of a stretch. Olivia's words are rigorously guarded, and she conscientiously pulls from the British literary canon to demonstrate her fluency in its empire and its power over others. After all, Morrison reminds us canon building is empire building, and what is quotation if not canon formation? And here's Olivia's canon. So these are all the texts that she quotes. They're all white men, and I'm going to lump the Bible into that as well. So nonetheless, though, by speaking these words through a Black body, she destabilizes their hegemony. And yet she still reinforces white art as the standard of literary work. So here's where Audre Lorde's timeless reminder that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house is key. Olivia returns to Jamaica, perhaps and maybe even likely having convinced her novel's readers that slavery is immoral. But at some point during her time in England, she's become figuratively more white than Black. Other scholars have identified this tension too. Julie Murray, for instance, argues that Olivia's fascination with country life sits at odds with her anti-slavery sentiments, since the former is often associated with the wealth that's been built through slavery. Olivia begins this novel associating explicitly with her Black brethren, but upon returning to Jamaica, she desires to, quote, resume instructing the minds and mending the morals of our poor Blacks. So using what Sarah Salee has called, quote, an elastic first person plural pronoun, because of the way that it fluctuates between embracing Blackness and whiteness. The possessive our puts Olivia in the role of moral and educational overseer here. And she adopts the language of slavery apologists who sought to indoctrinate Black enslaved people into Christian moral frameworks. In short, Olivia has not dismantled the master's house. If anything, she has moved in, even if she's redecorated a bit. She calls for slavery's end, but in reinforcing white British words as the citational bricks, to return to Ahmed, of this house, whiteness remains the dominant intellectual and cultural perspective, and the white reader remains safe, emotionally invested, and yet experientially outside Olivia's Blackness. So there's my works cited, and thank you so much for listening.